La vérité touche au réel.
Young Zizekians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging in conscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
Today, Max will be presenting on lecture 9 on nonsense and the structure of, or what is it? Gosh, on God and the structure of nonsense?
Yes. Yes.
Word.
Okay.
Take it away.
Then let's go. Okay. Yeah, someone is echoing. I don't know who that is, but nevertheless.
I'll mute.
Okay, as you said, I'm gonna present or summarize session 9 on nonsense and the structure of God. And I think that title is not the best title, because I think the most interesting part of this section, and that's the first key idea, is Lacan's comments on Ferdinand de Saussure and his linguistic theories, or at least that what his students summarized in the book that was published as the Causes, right? And basically, Lacan's idea here is that synchronic and diachronic linguistics cannot be separated, but from the synchronic structure, the diachronic processes follow. That's the most interesting idea, but there are two other ideas. And the second one, of course, is, as we all know, that the unconscious is structured like a language, as the saying goes, or it is symbolic. And then the third key idea relates to our dear Schreber, that the God in his delusion is essentially this symbolic unconscious appearing as a little other. But I'm going to start out with the first main point, which is a comment on de Saussure's linguistics. So Lacan starts out the lecture by basically referring back to the previous lecture, in which he brought up this turn of phrase, le mot me manque, like the word escapes me, or a more literal translation would be, the word is lacking. And he brings that up to say that throughout history, the uses of words changes. That's the basic point. And these changes of uses are so dramatic that people even record them when they appear. But he only uses this point and brings up all these different phrases to refer to Saussure and comment on his linguistics. And the paragraph where he does so starts out as such: the signified is not the things in their raw state already here, given in an order open to meaning. Meaning is human discourse insofar as it always refers to another meaning. Monsieur de Saussure, in his famous Courses on Linguistics, produces a diagram with one flux that is the meaning and another that is discourse, what we hear. So the diagram that he talks about, I will show in a second, but the main statement of this paragraph is basically that the realm of meanings and the realm of discourses cannot be separated. They are the same realm, basically. This meaning is human discourse. And this is a critique of Saussure's notion of signifier and signified. So now I'm going to give you some basics, right? So the signifier is a sound image, as we know. It is what we hear, as Lacan says, or how you would write the word. And the important thing is that the signifier on its own has no value. And the term value is really important here, because Saussure refers explicitly to economics. And he says, like, linguistics is a similar science to economics. So the signifier has no value on its own. It only has value in differentiation from other signifiers. What does it mean that the signifier has value? It basically means that it can carry meaning. It can be linked to this other realm, which is that of the signifieds. It can be tethered to a signified. Yeah. So basically that means the word cat needs to sound different and look different than the word dog, so it can be tethered to that concept of a cat or a dog. And the diagram Lacan is talking about is this diagram. And we see here that there are two different wavy clouds, and the top one is that of the meanings, or what Lacan calls meanings and Saussure calls concepts or signifieds, and the bottom one is that of signifiers, and they're linked together by these dotted lines. The first thing that this diagram expresses is that meanings and concepts, they are related through their mutual differentiation, but they are two separate realms, basically. In what sense are they related? So thoughts have to be differentiated so that they can have any kind of subsistence, right? Any kind of value also. So they have to be differentiated. We have to keep thoughts different from each other so that they don't overlap, right? That's pretty clear. But how do we keep them apart from each other? Well, we do that through signifiers. Because signifiers are materially differentiated, we can keep thoughts apart. But as I said, this differentiation is mutual. So on the other hand, if we hear a string of sounds, a string of words, or if we read a string of words on a page, maybe that's not correct. If we hear it, how do we know where to place the cuts between these signifiers? We know how to place these cuts because we know what meaning they have. So because we know that dog has a different meaning than cat, we can keep them apart. And this is where Lacan will critique Saussure. But I just want to follow Saussure's argument to the end and then come to Lacan. So what this in essence implies is that there's a one-to-one relation between signifiers and signifieds. For each signifier, there is one signified. And that means that this system is closed off. There is no necessary movement or change produced by this system. And this is what Saussure calls synchronic linguistics. Now, how does he picture movement? So synchronic linguistics, he sees as just one slice. So this closed off one system is like one slice of a longer chain of different changes throughout history. So of course, like any linguist, he has to accept languages change. Why this change happens is not explained through the synchronic system in itself, but it happens. And this whole chain, that's where diachronic linguistics comes in. So the different steps of historical development can be seen as like individual frames of a film. That's an example he uses. The frame in itself, it's complete. It doesn't have any movement, right? But if you look at them in a sequence, they have a movement. Or he also uses the example of a C-section of some kind of tissue, right? One tiny slice of that tissue, that's a synchronic system. But the entirety of that tissue or whatever it is, right? Maybe it's a vein. How that changes over time, that's diachronic linguistics. Maybe you could also place the diachronic in the intervals between these different historical steps of the linguistic system. But nonetheless, diachronic linguistics and synchronic linguistic completely differentiated. For Saussure, and he's really strong on this, there's no overlap between these two sciences because there is no necessary change in one synchronic system. And that's what Lacan criticizes. So he follows the argument completely that, of course, thoughts have to be distinguished and we can keep them apart through signifiers. Where he isn't that sure and where he says this diagram is questionable is this step. Not only because it's a completely different register. To say that you have to, if you hear a string of sounds, you have to place cuts in it through meaning. It's a completely different level of argumentation than the super abstract level of saying, well, thoughts have to be kept apart and we can only do that through words. right? Because the first one implies you have an experience of hearing, whereas the second one is only an abstract conceptual level. So that's what he criticizes. And in that sense, he also criticizes this diagram. That's what he refers to in the quote I read before. Because this diagram implies that signifieds exist in some kind of raw state. And that's what he doesn't accept. So he says the signified is not the thing in their raw state, already there, given in an order open to meaning. That's what he thinks is questionable. There are no two vapor clouds or something like that. There is only one. There is only discourse, and meaning arises from discourse. That's what he tries to argue in that first section. And I think that's why it's super important, because seldom he talks about that so clear. Like, he references that, but he not often mentions it or explicates it that detailed. So if there's only discourse and meaning follows from discourse, we can't have that one-to-one relation. Instead, you need two signifiers to have one signifier, basically. So you need two signifiers that are distinguished from each other, and they produce one signifier. And how do they do it? Of course, through metaphor, right? So one signifier needs another signifier, or even implies another signifier that succeeds the first one in metonymy, to differentiate the first one from the second one, because only through that signifiers have any kind of subsistence. And then the second one retroactively gives meaning to the first one, and that's metonymy. And in that system, there's always a lack produced, because there's always one signified or signifier, because now that's equal, missing, right? That means synchronic and diachronic linguistics can't be distinguished like that, can't be distinguished radically. They actually have an absolute overlap, because the system of signifiers necessarily produces some kind of change, some kind of temporal change in metonymy. Yeah, and that's what he says pretty clearly here. Like, this diagram is questionable. That's the diagram with the two clouds of the undistinguished realms of meaning and discourse. And he says, in fact, there are diachronic changes throughout history, throughout this structure, right? Underneath the same signifiers, there have been, over the course of time, these shifts, which prove that no one-to-one correspondence between the two systems can be established. That's exactly what he argues and what I try to express. So now, how does that relate to the unconscious, right? And he starts out that next section by saying that this unconscious that Freud depicts is similar to the structure of a pun, right? Yeah, he doesn't want to say that necessarily every symptom is a pun. So he says, this is not to say that symptoms are always based on puns, but they are always based on the existence of signifiers as such, on a complex relationship of totality to totality, or more exactly, entire system to entire system, of universe of signifiers to universe of signifiers. So now, where do symptoms and puns fit into that diagram I described before? I think most Lacanians would already know that, right? The pun is basically the metaphor. And the metaphor always substitutes for this lack of another signifier. And this very lack is what Lacan calls castration, not in that chapter necessarily, but in general, we know that. And a symptom does exactly that. It tries to suture that very lack through a pun, or on the level of signifiers, through a metaphor. And then I ask myself, what is he talking about with these universes and universes relating to each other? And now I cheated a little bit, right? And I looked at other seminars from Lacan, where he talks about set theory. And of course, when you hear universe, I immediately thought of there is no universe of the discourse, that famous quote, right? And that basically expresses that there's no set of all signifiers. And you could also picture that movement of metonymy and metaphor as like this constant movement to create this set of all signifiers. And I'm not an expert in set theory, but on a really naive level, you could say, you have this mass of signifiers, you have to extract one to signify the border around the set of all signifiers. But then you have extracted one, and one is missing from the set. And that's exactly the formula the operation again to include that extracted signifier. And that's what I try to picture here. So metaphor itself is this relation of, okay, you make one universe, oh, but you extracted one signifier, so you need to do that again and again and again. Yes, and then he goes on saying basically that only by talking about signifiers, and signifiers might be already too specific, you could also say structure, right? Because saying the unconscious is structured like a language implies that not everything is structured like a language. I mean, language is also structured. So he basically talking about structure and arguing that only by talking in this, with like referring to the idea of structure, you could legitimize the term from Freud that's called overdetermination, right? But the most interesting part about this quote was, for me, the last part here. The material linked to the old conflict is preserved in the unconscious as a potential signifier, as a virtual signifier, and then captured in the signified of the current conflict and used by it as language. That is as a symptom. Yeah. So I worked to this point and I was like, okay, how can I map what he's saying here on the structure that I tried to work out before? Of course, if you talk about Freud, that's super basic, right? I mean, we always have this infantile conflict and that reoccurs in a symptom. And it's always related to some kind of displacement. Like, for example, in the case of the rat man, I remember there him telling Freud a story from his childhood where he said as a child he had like a crush on this girl, but this girl wasn't interested in him. So he had this thought that maybe if his father died, she would have pity on him and would maybe through that gain interest in him. And then later on, his father died and he couldn't be at his deathbed. And then an immense guilt suddenly appeared. And this guilt is the symptom. But actually, this guilt came from an infantile conflict of him wishing that his father would die. So it was kind of displaced. So it was an old conflict and a current conflict. And there was this displacement happening. But how can we relate that to signifiers, right? So I would say, of course, every signifying chain implies another signifier. Like the famous phrase goes, every language implies a meta-language. That could be the virtual signifier he's speaking about. And this virtual signifier always relates to an old conflict in this chain because it always relates to this edge of the chain where one signifier is missing. How is this conflict resolved? By another signifier stepping in. Oh, I went too far. Another signifier stepping in through the metaphoric process, giving the previous signifier its metaphoric meaning. And then the old conflict would be the next signifier, which then was involved in the previous metaphor. And the current conflict would be that signified, produced in that metaphoric movement. And then, of course, there's another virtual signifier because the chain never ends. Yeah, and this is not just an abstract argumentation that Lacan gives here. because this has like real consequences for the clinic, for how an analyst approaches an analysand, right? So I really like this passage because here he's saying that the idea that there's an original experience that cannot be expressed in language is absurd or is not legitimate, because we are talking about explicitly linguistic structures. So the idea that you first have an experience that has nothing to do with rational processes, and then you rationalize it or you intellectualize it, as he says here, is not correct, because this experiences that the psychotic has is already a rational one, is already an intellectual kind of operation, right? And then he goes on with further tips for the analysts, right? Or references to our patient we are talking about, Schreber, which is, first of all, that psychiatrists, in contrast to psychoanalysts, think that psychotics are somehow abnormal, right? That they have nothing rational about them. But that's actually a kind of defense mechanism, because the important thing about the psychotic is, for him, this whole symbolic process is not unconscious. It appears to him in imaginary form, as an imaginary other. And he says that by saying basically the psychotic takes everything serious. I mean, and the seriousness that he's talking about in some sense is that he experiences this symbolic other in imaginary reality. And that psychotics are not abnormal is also pretty clear in Schreber's whole behavior, because, and also when you read his book, it's pretty clear he's very, very rational. I mean, he's talking about absurd things, but his argumentation is very rational, and he really tries to make sense of all of this in a very rational way. And that's why Lacan, as we said before we started to record, says he's a disciple of the Aufklärung. He's even one of his last representatives. I really like that quote. That's so lovely. Yeah, and that means also that the Unsinn, or the nonsense that Schreber is talking about, is not completely void or completely, in some sense, useless for an analyst. It's structured. It doesn't necessarily produce some kind of sense, but it has a structure. So it's Unsinn, it's nonsense, but it's structured nonsense. And from that structure, we can deduce something as an analyst. Yeah, but of course he has different warnings. For example, yes, the Unsinn is not completely void of rational structures, but we shouldn't be that quick in our understanding. So that's one of the things he warns against, to have some kind of too hasty understanding, as he points out when saying that someone who read his copy of Schreber's book wrote in the margins that Schreber is describing some kind of Neoplatonist god or something like that. So there is structure, but be careful with understanding, right? And then another level of that is, don't try, like a psychiatrist would do, to order anything that Schreber says. Like, don't force it into some kind of sense. Don't make the nonsense into sense, but take time. Like, that's one of the main tips he gives, like to take time. And the main goal of the analyst should be to make the patient speak as long as possible. So instead of taking the structured nonsense and making it structured sense, just let him talk and try to deduce the structure from that. Now, how does all that relate to Schreber? Like, how does in his delusion God appear, or which Lacan now multiple times linked to the unconscious? How does this symbolic structure appear? So there are multiple characteristics, and I couldn't really deduce from this chapter a satisfactory link to the symbolic, but I'm just going to list all the different attributes Lacan pointed out. So the first thing is, this God has different kinds of manifestations. There's flexic, there are the tested souls, the upper God, the lower God, lots of different manifestations. But what links them is that they all relate to Schreber, and they relate to him in a really specific sense, which is the liegen lassen, right? The being forsaken, or the letting lie. Yeah, forsaken sounds way too fancy for the simplicity of these words, liegen lassen. It's literally letting something lie somewhere. So all of them are basically this one God. That's what Lacan says. And they all have the same relation to him, but of course they are slightly different. Like in the beginning of his delusion, this letting lie is way more violent. And of course, all this letting lie is feminizing Schreber. Basically, in the beginning of his delusion, it's Flechsig trying to feminize Schreber so that he can be raped, basically. And then later that turns into God feminizing Schreber so that he can recreate the universe, repopulate the earth, all that. But the important thing is, in this relation, not only that it's feminizing, but also that it is necessary, but in a very ambivalent way. So even though it is very painful to Schreber, even though it is uncomfortable, it is necessary to maintain this relation to God, because if it is not maintained, then even more painful phenomenon happen. And he talks about these phenomenon in detail in the next chapter. On the other hand, it's important to keep God at some kind of distance, right? Because the whole crisis of the universe in Schreber's delusion is in part caused because Schreber is so nervous. Not only nervous, but also this voluptuousness. And these two factors attract God. But if God comes too close, entering Schreber's body, he will dissolve, he will disintegrate. And we don't want that to happen. On the other hand, if God retreats too far, also very painful phenomenon happen to Schreber. So it's super ambivalent. And we talked about that before, of course. So now I thought I'd write down some aspects of this God. And this is a quote from Schreber's book in the English translation. And he basically says that what attracts God, or what his relation to God characterizes, is thinking and voluptuousness. These are the two things. And voluptuousness is related to this being a sexual feminine being. Lacan also points out that God only appears to him in a speaking mode. So God only has some kind of presence through talking to Schreber. So he's very strongly connected to thinking, some kind of feminine sexuality, and talking, language. And that's another note that Lacan makes. It's not the kind of God that, like the Christian God, that or some kind of image of the Christian God in a naive sense, that he punishes you if you're bad, or he rewards you if you're good, or something like that. What Schreber also mentions is that the rays that come from God provoke him to think. They want to force him to think by using this system of not finishing a sentence. So they give him like a half sentence to provoke him to think, to finish that sentence. And he then talks also about multiple mechanisms, how he defends himself against having to finish that sentence, right? On another note, it's also that whenever he finishes the sentence in a way that he has previously already done, these rays tell him, oh, we have already noted that down. Or another way they provoke him to think is everything he sees in his surrounding is expressed in a word. And if they already have that word recorded, we will come to that in the last point, they say, oh yeah, we already wrote that down. Yeah, not only that, but this God also does not understand human needs at all. So, of course, Schreber says he doesn't relate to human beings, or he's able to look into the hearts of human beings. He can only relate to them as dead bodies, or when they as souls become part of him with all the nerves that they have where all their life experience is recorded. But I think naming this point that he doesn't understand human needs is necessary, because many examples that Schreber gives are about human needs. And one example that I really liked from his book was defecation. Okay. So what this God miracles in him, often he says, is that he has to shit. He miracles into him the need to take a dump. Not only that, and here the politics of half measures, as he calls it, or the perfidy, as Lacan points out, comes into play. So he miracles into him the need to defecate. And then at the same moment, he miracles that someone already occupies the toilet. So Schreber cannot use the toilet. So he has to use a bucket. And then the nerves ask him, why do you not shit? And they taunt him with that. And they give the answer, because I am somehow stupid. That's the answer they give. So before he uses the bucket, of course. That relates also to the idea that if he doesn't think anything, then the rays or God think that he is completely stupid. But to go further, that example, when he then is able to defecate, this is an enormous enjoyment for the nerves. This is like extreme enjoyment, like the relief of that. And there the English translation was a little bit creative, because the last passage of this quote was then translated as that the rays miracle this urge to defecate away. So they take it away. In the German translation, it was a little bit more ambivalent. He used the word zurückzuwundern, which could also be read as the urge tried to recreate in him the need for defecation. So maybe that could relate to the drive, but I'm not comfortable with using this word. Yeah, so they have a really strange understanding and a really strange kind of enjoyment-related thing to the human needs. And then the last point, as I noted before, is that Schreber also has, as part of his delusion, that he thinks God installed on a faraway planet fleetingly improvised men that have no thoughts of their own, no understanding of their own, to record all his thoughts, to write down all of his thoughts. And this is related to this provoking him to think, because the nerves seem to want to record all possible human thoughts. That's what he says. He thinks this writing down system is kept to write down all possible human thoughts, which Schreber says himself seems absurd because you can make up so many different thoughts. Yeah, these are the main characteristics. And now we can discuss how they relate to the symbolic unconscious, because I'm not quite sure.
That was good. That was really good.
Well done, well done. Beautiful slides. A lot of thought-provoking questions. A lot of
or we can also talk about the signifier logic if you want to, because I wasn't
that's
about
what
that.
yeah, that's something I was wondering about, because the only thing I wasn't clear on, and I know none of us are totally aufklärung on this topic, but is when it comes to metonymy and metaphor, we have metonymy as a kind of, let's say, operation of displacement is how I think of it. We have one signifier filling in a lack of meaning in another signifier, and so on ad infinitum. But metaphor, on the other hand, is dependent on metonymy, but
Yes.
distinct from it, as I understand it. What then is metaphor?
I mean, for me, I'm not quite sure if I'm 100% correct on that, right? And you can correct me, Andrew, in a second. So I think the way I understood it, and I'm pretty sure we're going to come to that in this seminar also, but the way I understood it is that, of course, every signifier needs another signifier to be differentiated from it. So that's already how you have metonymy, right? Every signifier implies another one. But what is displaced there? Displaced there is just the lack of another signifier. You have one signifier that's basically just the lack of another signifier. And metaphor is filling in that lack. So you have one signifier, another one, and the second one fills in the lack of the previous one. And this filling in the lack is how I understood.
Right. Because that's what the if we're talking about metaphor specific to psychoanalysis and the neurotic, it is the paternal metaphor, this name of the father, which is also the know of the father, and how it is represented by a lack. And what drives this logic is what Lacan evokes, and he'll evoke it again in the next chapter, about the importance of the elementary structure of language has presence and absence, which isn't necessarily the case for Schreber, but for your neurotic, something can be absent but yet manifest itself in the speech, and this is what is structured by Verneinung, that as soon as a verbal utterance of linguistic crisscrossing happens, fresh brains, that is not my mother, the signifier that should have been there is maintained in its absence. And I mean, this could go back to what you marked down, how old conflicts, maybe we could call them infantile, or what virtual signifiers that remain on the level of the unconscious manifest in a current conflict, but not in its immediate form, but in an inversion. Like looking at your diagram of these different universes of signifiers, I like to see it as the signifier is always already an inversion. It's like a redoubling of itself. And this to me is like a way that we could see Freud's Vorstellung Repräsentanz kind of playing out in not just acts of displacement and condensation via repression, but also for the signifier, a redoubling and inversion, but through this logic, this binary logic of presence and absence, which for Schreber, it's like, no, he says that God remains present, but like it's only through like this speech, or the way he talks, nerve contacts and all that stuff. But another thing like you could see is like this old conflict and this patient that he evokes about like how in threat of being hit by a car, he evokes this term in his head, brain damage. And it's not necessarily that brain damage were to occur from this accident, but it's that something residual, an old conflict, to use what he lists right here for a signifier that's virtual, something in the unconscious, manifests itself in this presence, but like what it relates to is absent. Like what is a signifier for another signifier, if that makes sense. So that was like some of my kind of points that I had on this. And also another thing to add, one more thing to add for this like critique of the binary of just this 1-to-1 ratio of signifier and signified. It's like the philosopher and the psychiatrist think that they could penetrate, the reality, the signified, especially like with a delusional. But like, what does Lacan start off the seminar with like listing down all these phrases, right? And especially the one that you talked about, which was the word is lacking, or the word escapes me. And I found it funny to kind of connect it to what the psychiatrist would say. It's like, go about your day in an orderly fashion. It's like the presupposition as if there was a word there existing prior to it being lacking or missing, right? This metaphysical presupposition. And there's this presupposition of a way to live orderly, right? And by saying that there is, the signified is a world that is ordered and you're not right. And it's like Lacan is trying to say like, no, like Schreber in all his delusions, though they may seem to be out of pocket and not applicable to the symbolic order, nevertheless, his disturbances have a sort of efficacy to him and only him to allow him to operate. So pretty much,
And I mean, they are rational.
They're rational, yeah.
They are structured. They are not. It's not like his brain is broken.
Yeah.
And what it makes me think of is like how when you were distinguishing synchrony from diachrony, it's like the psychoanalyst in this example that you brought up Andrew, who wants the patient to proceed in an orderly fashion, is almost approaching language as if it is distinctly and uniquely synchronic, in the sense that we need to take these specific, like, excised sections of the delusion, rearrange the signifiers so that they conform to a synchronic kind of reality, which of course ignores the diachronic dimension of it. And what I'm thinking is, what's ignored there, in a sense, is metaphor, which is dependent on the mechanism of repression, in the sense that only a neurotic, and I guess possibly a pervert, is capable of metaphorizing. Whereas, well, what does Schreber suffer when it comes to his unique relationship to language? He suffers the metonymic constant displacement of language, which of course results in this duplication, multiplication of little egos. But I think what Lacan wants to emphasize with the temporal dimension of the signified in this sense is that metaphor is only possible for a neurotic, in that, yes, subsumed within, under the metaphor, is an entire series of metonymic displacements, but it's almost like rapid fire, to the point that you can say Juliet is the sun,
Yeah.
and it can be evocative because of this diachronic dimension, which flies in the face of this idea of the two hazy streams that are
Even
distinct.
God to him is still like, it's particular. There is no like sort of quilting for like God as like a sort of one thing. And that's why like his critique of that one guy saying like, oh, it's a Platonian God, because he uses the term emanation, where it's like, no, for Plotinus, emanation is sort of hierarchical. There is this first one principle, which is a trinity of like what he would call the one, the good, and the beautiful, but they have a sort of hypostatic union. And what we have is a hierarchy of, from top to bottom, but yet they still relate to one idea, one principle that can be known through, I don't know, was it noesis or whatever, the sort of Platonic thing. The main point is that they still relate to a common thread, which for Schreber, it's like we have this multiplicity of distinct voices that are so radically distinct that they only have relation to Schreber at a particular point. And so I wonder.
I think Lacan tries to make the opposite point. I think he tries to make the point that they are united. I mean, they are constantly fracturing, but they are structurally the same.
Well, yeah, they're the same insofar as that they're for Schreber, but it's like on their own. There's no like, again, he comes up with the theological question at the end: does God, interfere with like, what is it, with chance?
Yeah.
When he evokes the thing about, can God predict the number drawn in the lottery?
I mean, I was like, wow, that's so interesting. What does Schreber have to say about that? And then I read that page, and Schreber was like, yeah, there are all these theological questions and so on, but really they are stupid, because God doesn't think like an individual person, and he doesn't care about anything like that. Like the other examples was like, could God intervene in a war or something like this? And his solutions for these questions are, God doesn't think like a human. For him, there is no temporality like a human. So he doesn't have this individual motivation, right? Sadly, he doesn't talk that detailed about chance. I thought the example was so interesting.
Right. And it's also interesting that for God, like, the last thing I'll say is that like he can only know stuff about human affairs when all these souls go up to blessedness, and he records, all the things in their nerve contact. And it's like little by little he can get record of human affairs, especially for Schreber, but ultimately like there's no grand narrative for his world, right?
Yeah.
I think that
Schreber says he's like
unity,
distant from creation. Like he doesn't intervene in creation, and he doesn't understand his creation in that sense.
It's almost like a deist God, if you like, the clock winding God, Cartesian sort of God, winds the clock, but then he
the watchmaker
cleans his hands of his creation. But one thing that I'm also thinking of, and I think we were alluding to it in some of the voice notes we shared, but this idea of temporality, I'm trying to think of it in terms of the diachronic, but this anticipation of meaning, right? This meaning on the horizon, which is characteristic of neurosis, which is characteristic of the chain of signifiers. And we can't help but ourselves anticipate the quilting point here, which we're always anticipating a quilting point in meaning. But for Schreber, the situation is vastly different. There isn't this temporality in that way. And we've talked about this before. If you follow the course of his delusions, they spring off into different directions, right? In his mind, there is something like a historical truth to it. Like he's very obsessed with history and lineage and like dynasties and things like that, which is very interesting. But that seems to be the extent to which he can approximate something like linearity in a
Right.
way.
And for
There's
him,
no
there is
linearity.
temporality. Like,
But isn't that interesting though about what you said, Nick, and you brought this up in your PowerPoint, Max, about the gods never finish their sentence, or Schreber never finishes a sentence. How can you have
yes,
a
he
quilting
does.
point? Schreber
Yeah, no,
finishes.
he does, and he has that temporal experience. Like he gives a super vivid example of it. He says, when these rays try to provoke me to think, I feel like a parent sitting and listening to my children who are doing an exam, and I am like constantly hoping that the child gives the right example, like anticipating it. And he says that's why it's so torturous to him. Or a different example he gives is a judge listening to a mentally impaired person trying to finish his sentence. And he says it's so torturous if you listen to that person because like, oh my God, get to the end. What do you want to say? So he experiences definitely that temporality that tortures him. But I think the thing about the quilting point that he doesn't have is that neurotic delusion, which is delusional, that there can be a final signifier. So I think the repression that the neurotic is based on is that he really believes that there's like an ending point. And
Yeah.
for a while he sits on it, and that's his symptom. Like his symptom is clinging to a final metaphor that he thinks is the final one. Right? And the psychotic cannot do that. For him, it's endless metonymy, but he definitely has that temporal experience. And I think another thing I wanted to add just really quickly is that why he criticizes understanding related to the word emanation is exactly that kind of metaphor. Like you think, oh, I got final understanding. It's all about emanation. It's like you made a final metaphor, like I can make this set total, like it's all about emanation, right? That's a neurotic kind of thing, and that's like understanding as an imaginary process of the ego, right? One last thing, okay? Because you said, Nick, that the psychiatrist would imagine language as purely syncretic, right? Synchronic, yes. I think it's a little bit different because you could use a different kind of critique from Lacan in this chapter. I think the psychiatrist, he would think that there is really signifieds in their raw state, that there is some kind of non-linguistic world out there, right, that you can refer to. So you just have to say to the psychotic, yeah, just look at reality. I mean, reality is like this. It's neutral. It's not linguistic. And then your delusion is solved or something like this. Like,
Right.
get
And
order.
that's where he evokes Bergson with his whole thing about like this raw experience that we could tap into, because he's like a sort of vitalist thinker that is against the sort of notion of like, I think he's like one of those thinkers that tries to invert Platonism in a way that like Deleuze does, but like more of like this sort of like raw immanence nature vitalistic. So in a sense, like he's a proponent of this prejudice of like tapping into like reality as it is rather than this sort of mediated by notion, dialectic, or even what we're talking about right here, a sort of signifier, a reality. And that's like totally wrong, because then you get into this like you don't even bother to analyze the delusion and
Yeah.
see the meaning there. Like there is meaning and there is presence in this delusions that happen for Schrader, and that the fact like he may be mad and nervous and they're like they have no relation to the symbolic reality of the analyst or the neurotic, but yet they do have a sort of duration for him to survive, because it's like that obstacle you said, that like he maintains his illusion with God. If God's too far, then it becomes a problem. If God's too close, then he dissolves and dies. So it's like the obstacle that he hopes will come to an end is also what allows him to sustain that delusion.
Well, what's interesting, if we could like kind of bring it all together and take it back to what we've touched on in this example of your typical psychiatrist and their approach to the de-intellectualized, let's call it, raw state of experience, which would be like the signified, that is the pulp of the signifier in some sense. I'm glad you made that amendment on what I said, Max, because it's kind of like the best image that comes to mind for me is this sort of, for the neurotic, a horizon of final meaning. And it's both, in some sense, like you're saying, the final signifier, which is the container for the set of all signifiers, but
Yeah.
also, wouldn't it be the ultimate signification of his life, his identity, and the truth of reality itself? Whereas the kind of anticipation that Schreber is dealing with, everything ultimately hangs on what these voices say to him in this disjointed, interrupted fashion. And to the extent that he's able to have an ultimate horizon of meaning, it depends on the distance that he's able to maintain from God, who is his approximate big other.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that neurotics definitely anticipate that final signifier of meaning, but I mean, maybe I'm not sure about this. I just
Yeah,
had
they
that
would
idea recently.
anticipate, especially like if we talk about obsessional. What makes them so obsessed with mastery is not like to find like a master, like like Jacques Lacan says, like you want a master, you're gonna get one. But like when they endure analysis for so long, they think that they got it, and like they anticipate that the analyst will be like, oh, that's the symptom right there. Carry
Yeah.
on your day. But like when they stumble upon a meaning, when they associate off of their free time, because if the transference is strong enough, you'll be transferring on your analysis outside of the session, and then they bring it in thinking that like they did work, and find out that they don't get the reaction from the analyst, and so they're anticipating like, why did I fail, what did I do wrong, and then something comes up that they didn't even realize. Like there is a sort of quilting, but not what they expected. There's a sort of irony that comes out from the obsessional. Whereas, like, I guess to go back to what you were saying, Max, like Schreber never gets an end. It's just continuous and continuous.
I mean, he definitely imagines an end.
He
And
imagines
it is he will be a woman. And he thinks, I mean, he solves his whole conflict and he figures everything out and becomes a functioning psychotic again by having this horizon of someday I will finally completely transform into a woman and then I will be the wife of God, right? Something like that. But I think kind of the difference between a psychotic and a neurotic, and I'm not 100% sure about that. It's definitely metaphor, right? The psychotic, he has this anticipation of meaning. Yes, in these sentences, he's tortured by these sentences, forcing him to end them. So he has that temporal anticipation. But what he cannot do is put a symptom in place that will make his world stable. And every neurotic is in some sense based on a symptom. You cannot be completely healed, right? We know that. Like your world is not based on a final meaning, but it's based on some kind of final conflict. Right? That in essence is just a paternal metaphor.
right, and that's how symptoms manifest in neurosis, is through the speech act, through the portmanteaus. I mean, that's why he says like that the Freudian unconscious isn't necessarily structured like a pun, but symptoms can manifest in a pun-like fashion.
Yeah.
This is what is exemplary of the degradation of the ego's empty speech, and we get the manifestation of full speech. Or, like I was saying, the elementary form of the symbolic order for a neurotic in their language is that of presence and absence. That's something present can come up in the speech act, and yet the signifier is absent. I think that's why he's emphasizing so much on Verneinung in the past, and he mentions it again in the next chapter with presence and absence. But
What I thought, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, like, that
Interrupt.
example that you gave in your slide is perfect about how, during a current conflict that a signifier steps in to fill in the lack. Like, I think that's like pretty much for saying the same thing. I'm just saying
Yeah.
the binary of presence and absence is
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But it's like, I thought what was interesting and kind of cryptic is how he says, a symptom can sort of take the form of a pun, but it's a pun that doesn't exist in a given language. What did you two make of that?
Well, I mean, I would say that it's only so much, like, as far as it's like useful for analysis, not like symptom whose, if we call it a metaphor, is that of like the letter, this combinatory factor of certain phonetic, all this other stuff. Like, I always resort back to, my default is poor jelly. If poor jelly is a sort of
Right.
metaphor for a symptom for Leclerc's patient, what does it have but to the key to a symptom and nothing outside of analysis? I mean, we could say that, or like maybe something like when Michael Downs talks about, like, signifier really has no meaning at all, like Zoogie Lube. But when they stand in duration for a long time, they take on the function of a signifier. That these metaphors that you said have no relation to everyday or ordinary language, but in analysis, the more you contemplate on it, the more that you associate on it, there is a diachronic aspect. It does take on a discourse.
So to me, it's like, if you think on the super schematic level, right? Wait, does this blur this out? No.
I can see it.
So if you have one signifier, so this is the pun to me, right? If you have one signifier, it implies another one that gives it its meaning through metaphor. But this other one, it has no meaning, right? So it's empty. So that it doesn't exist in a related language. So actually, there needs to be another signifier to fill that emptiness that the one represents, the second signifier. Is that understandable? Wait, I will put numbers, okay?
Wait, the zero, the barred zero is the signified.
It's like void. I'm saying void. I'm trying to express void. So if you have signifier one, it is void. It's just the desire for another signifier. So it needs another one that metonomically follows it. And this second one, signifier two, retroactively sustains the first one through metaphor. Right? This gives it its subsistence. This is the pun. But the second one is still empty. Like, it doesn't exist in that sense. It needs another one. That's how I understood it. So there's a pun that doesn't exist. The pun equals metaphor for me. That's what he's trying to say.
It's synonymous with metaphor.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, because it's a play on words. So you have two different words, and they compare to each other. And so like, I don't know if the meaning necessarily cancels out, but you got like two meanings that conflict with each other when you make a pun.
It's like two signifiers together, literally metaphor.
Yeah.
What's the example for a pun? Nom du père.
Yeah, I mean, right. Like this, like different play on words. I mean,
it's funny how nom du père also, when he talks about it, illustrates what he's saying about the unitariness or lack thereof when you break up words. He breaks up nom du père to mean three different things: the know of the father, name of the father, and the non-duped heir. So it's like, it's an illustration of the decomposition of language in its capacity to get away from us, in its
Right.
signified, right? He's illustrating right there, signifies three different things
Right.
simultaneously, and it's only like a looking awry at the word itself that just shifts the meaning.
Yeah, no,
But
yeah.
but the thing that's frustrating about puns and what people might criticize Lacan for is like, oh, so you're going to try to earmark different chapters, different subsections of your entire system of thought on the basis of what appears to be just a chance correspondence here, like a contingent generation of meaning based on the fact that we just have these syllables in a specific arrangement. Whereas he's saying, but no, that is how concepts work. That is how this other
Right.
this hazy cloud is generated from signifiers in their sort of autonomy. At least not autonomy in the sense that one signifier can perform its own agency, but they're all reliant on each other. But they generate imaginary meaning in this polyvalent way, which only happens to coincide with a certain morpheme or phoneme in its in a specific arrangement, but ultimately determines a kind of like affinity between meanings and
Right.
what's understood.
Yeah, I mean,
Does
look
that make
at
sense?
like Freud's famous example of the way he free associates on forgetting the painter of Orvieto, Signorelli. He lists up all these different names, Botticelli, Botticelli, and he's just like going down, and there's all these like sort of internal rhyme schemes to connect to the name, and how Signorelli stood in and yet was absent for a patient who killed themselves after becoming impotent, and was like, a life without sex is not worth living. And also his discovery of infantile sexuality, which was pretty much he was not comfortable talking about, in his colleagues who were, distinguished scientists. So the thought of like sexual theory and infantile sexuality, which is Freud's discovery of sex, was, just prohibited. And so that guilt of losing a patient to a discourse that he's just discovering, plus feeling, afraid to talk about sex with scientists, and thus losing his reputation, collide with life and death and judgment in Signorelli.
Man, Freud is so beautiful every
Yeah.
time.
I also
Never
found out that
misses.
his first name is Luca, like Signorelli. I didn't know that. I looked it up the other
I
day.
also didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like Luke or Luca, I think.
But
I,
I think
yeah.
ultimately it's kind of these morphemic elements, these constituents that make up words, ultimately like they have a determining kind of agency in their very materiality.
Yeah,
And I think that's
Yeah.
what he means by pun and symptom.
right, right. And I kind of seen that example though that I give is like how a current conflict or a current like concrete reality that Freud was seeing this painting could make him forget something, and that was like the sort of in the psychic apparatus, memory failed, thoughts failed. There was the sort of gap of registering meaning, and how the signifier became absent, and so he's bringing up to presence different signifiers that kind of fit that sort of chain. I don't know if it would be metaphoric or metonymic or what.
But I think like what the thing you're pointing out, Nick, is super true, and I also don't really know how to like figure that out. I have the tendency to wanting to fit everything in a system, which is neurotic, right? Making it a whole. I'm like, yeah, okay, metaphor, metonymy, that makes sense to me. But then what you're saying is a different kind of aspect, right? Whereas in these puns, the metaphor, where's the metonymy, right? In these examples, like with the forgetting of the name, it's like more something different is expressed, that like the materiality that is stupid in some sense determines it. Like with the red man, like red and the other one Raten, right? The bills, they sound similar, and that's why he has a similar kind of reaction to them. But I don't know how to fit that in with signifiers and so on. It's more like the materiality of words have some kind of effect in the stupid machinery of our mind, you know, and that is kind of similar like the God who is stupid. One example with the shitting he gives is that, what was it again? God doesn't want to let him shit because of a certain phrase that is misunderstood by God as too literal, which was something like the wife of God shits on the entirety of the world or something, which is like a common phrase in German. Auf etwas scheißen means you don't care, right? So God misunderstands that phrase, like the wife of God shits on the world for some, and then that's the reason why he wants to stop him from shitting. But I don't know the reasoning exactly, but it's what you're trying to say, that this materiality of the word disconnected from the meaning has some kind of effect. Disconnected from our human meaning, how we are supposed to use it.
Yeah, it's like the example, and I wish I could recall it in better detail, but Serge Leclerc gives of psychosis where he had a patient who, because of some of the syllables in the word hat, and I think some of the syllables in the word cheating were the same, he needed to wear a specific hat at a specific time in order to ensure that his wife wasn't cheating on him. So these psychotics have an entire series of rituals that essentially tame language, that are attempts to tame language, but they are martyrs to the unconscious, as Lacan puts it, to the degree that they are more viscerally aware of, you know, the amorphousness of language in its phonetic morphemic reality, right? That the audio image, they're more aware of language as an audio image. That's what a neurotic represses, is that words are audio.
He's in the
We want
meaning.
we want the meaning. We see language as a husk to be removed, and we want what's inside.
Yeah.
But we're always disappointed because it's never there. Whereas for the psychotic, everything's too much there.
Yeah.
Because they're too aware of language.
Like what he says in the next chapter, in chapter 10, where it's like, we think we are individuals who are free and so on, right? But what he tries to express with all this talk about the materiality of the signifier, or when he says he's a true materialist and things like this, it's like he's just trying to say that thought structures, I guess, have some kind of materiality that's like mechanic and stupid. Like it doesn't understand the meaning. It just works on this material of the words, like with the forgetting of the name Signorelli, right? It's like also these different parts of the word have different associations because they sound similar. And this kind of stupidity of like taking things too literal, this is also what appears in Schreber's delusion. Like these people who record his words, he says they are like stupid machines. They don't even understand the meaning of my thoughts or of the words I'm saying. They just write it down without understanding anything. And it's kind of sometimes the image that Lacan draws of the unconscious as this machinery of signifiers, right?
Right. No, definitely. I mean, I think like overall, like as we continue to learn more about Schreber's delusion, it's like I love how Lacan is not only so focused on Schreber, but also trying to break down how language operates. And it's like how language couldn't be more important than in this specific case to show like, you know, how we used to treat psychosis as psychiatrists or ego psych bros is totally, you know, wrong. And we need to like pay attention to the subject's relation to language. And I really like this, what he notes that there is a distinction between Schreber who speaks in his writing and then the subject of Schreber in the delusion. right?
Yeah.
It seems like I could be wrong, but there is this relationship between this subject, which is all too alienated from Schreber in these delusions, kind of like God, because if we see like how narcissism works for Schreber, it's like there is a secondary one, and it does relate back to his body, the nerves, but only insofar as that these voices connect to him and are only for him. And yet this voice of God is so distant, like the subject, because it is a weird verbal alienation. And in the delusions, there are a sort of alienation that are way from alienation of the neurotic, in which, you know, you go through alienation, castration, separation. And so like we get like this subject that manifests in the delusion through these voices, through these anticipations, imagining an end of being, you know, God's lover, of finally meeting God, but also in the fact that he has trouble finishing his sentences. And I know you said that he does in times finish his sentences, but it's like, didn't you say like these voices were like, oh, we already wrote that down, you know? And so like,
No, they give him these unfinished sentences to provoke him, and he says his nerves immediately want to answer. Like he says,
right,
it's similar to schema L. He says it's like in common human talking when you say hello and then someone else replies hello, like this automatic reply. That's what they try to force on him.
right. Well, it is because if we have a finished sentence, we have not only a subject, but like a predicate, like we have a subject of the statement, and it retroactively goes to like who it's addressed to. So it's like, that's what also happens in a quilting point. I know like in, I don't know if it's in Michael Downes's Phallus post, but he talks about the emphasis of quilting point and, you know, how it ties in with the ending of a sentence, which the meaning retroactively goes back to the beginning of the statement. And so it's like, that's what Schreber has to fill in because he's waiting for them to finish. Michael uses this example. I don't know where it's from. He's referencing some literary writer that's talking about like linguistics, but it's like the example, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like he gently caresses her soft skin, right? You would think that's something romantic, with the edge of his knife after just butchering her up. Like then the meaning changes because the end of the sentence comes and then it retroactively goes back to the first. And that seems like that's something that Schreber's having a hard time with, which comes up in a neurotic as a quilting point, but never as he would imagine, because he always tries to master the interpretation or the analyst.
But I mean, it's so we talked about that there's always this anticipation in talking for meaning. And the thing is, Schreber definitely experiences that. So he definitely has this anticipation, but he feels tortured by it because these nerves constantly tell him, they use like sentences like, isn't it that ... like isn't it true that, and then he's supposed to finish that sentence. And in the beginning he says his nerves answered immediately,
Right.
like automatically they answered, but he tried to stop that, right? And some techniques are that he's saying poetry. Instead of finishing the sentence, he tries to defend against this finishing the sentence by saying poetry, or he also says that he just repeats that fragmented sentence to defend himself against having to finish it. He's like, isn't it true that, isn't it true that, isn't it true that? He just repeats it without finishing it. So yes, there is like this almost mechanical response of his nerves to wanting to finish it, but he doesn't like it. Like he wants to defend against it because it is compulsion, and he doesn't like that compulsion. It tortures him. But yeah, so he definitely has that anticipation. What he doesn't have is that his world, in some sense, is made a whole through a much deeper form of metaphor. You know what I'm saying?
And that's the main thing that what quilting point does. I guess my point was, it wasn't a matter of does he have anticipation or not. It's that does, when he's forced to finish the sentence out of compulsion, does it quilt towards a sort of universal meaning, worldview, or, you know, universal equivalent, which would be an S1, a signifier, that for a neurotic structure binds all signifiers to an S1.
Yeah, and I think what we talked about before, that he then has that horizon of meaning, that is his cure, really. That is his cure. Like having this story he tells about himself, that someday he will completely turn into a woman and he will rebirth and repopulate the universe. This is how he solves that his psychosis is so unbearable, and how he becomes like a functioning psychotic, right? By creating the story. And it is definitely not a neurotic kind of metaphor, but it's like a super imaginary kind of metaphor, something like that. It's like a imaginary thing that steps in for a missing symbolic process, maybe you could say. I don't know.
It makes me think of D&G. It's like he did territorialized.
Yeah,
It's like,
absolutely.
last week when we were talking about the ego ideal and how it relates to the quilting point. For the neurotic, they have this backdrop of the master signifier, or maybe we can even say grouping of different master signifiers that constitute their ego ideal. They're quilted to it in the sense that we have the battery of signifiers. We have S1 as its supposed container, which is elusive. In its imaginarized form, maybe it's our national identity, sexuality, profession, blah, blah, blah. And it's always precarious. Ultimately, all
Yeah,
of those things can somehow be denied to us, undermined, fall apart, become too much. But there is this sort of backdrop to rely on. The only fear is that the neurotic is always falling short of this ego ideal, or it could be completely shattered by a humiliation, disgrace, whatever.
mm,
You can lose your job. You can lose an important part of your identity. That's when people go into analysis. The symptom fails to work.
yeah,
But for Schraber, it's like he does have something like an ego ideal. It is the most grandiose ideal, ego ideal one could have, which is the bride of God, essentially, to repopulate all of humanity. But it hasn't happened yet. So to take it back to that dimension of the anticipation, you're right, Max, for correcting me there. It's like he absolutely has temporality and a sense of anticipation, but it is when he will one day perform this definite act, a definable act,
it's
which will
true about
repopulate
it.
all of humanity. For the neurotic, though, and it's kind of funny because if you kind of look at it awry, if you invert it, it's like, well, you know what? Maybe that there is more rationality to having a definite goal than us in our obsessional, neurotic, frenzied kind of like, whether it's like careerism or competing with each other in different petty ways. The neurotic can't ever really admit to themselves like what they want because it's always diffuse. It's
Yeah,
always like kind of coming into view, and this identity, this that depends on an ego ideal which they forged for themselves, is always very precarious. It can be taken from them at any time. For Schraber, identity isn't really his problem. He knows exactly what he was put on earth to do. It's only that there are all of these forces vying for his attention that seem to threaten this mission, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that because you've read the memoir more carefully
it
than I have,
shifts
but there's
all
like
the
a
time.
threat.
So sometimes yes.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There's the yawning blackness, of course, that he's going to be swallowed into if he doesn't, keep God at a distance in this way. But
Yeah.
it's like one thing's for sure. He knows what he was, called upon to do. His interpolation. It's funny because it's like an interpolation, but it's like it doesn't fail in the sense that he's able to 100% identify with it.
Right,
But
because
language
that's
itself, the voices themselves are what, fuck with him.
right, because that's the main thing about the neurotic and primary narcissism is that there is the ego ideal that comes as striving to one day be this, and yet they don't want to admit to their lack, but the feeling of lack comes up. So it's like there's this endless desire of what the other wants, or what I will be in the face of the other. It's like, what did Todd say? It's like his example was like about playing basketball, about like not just like scoring the shot, but seeing like how the coach sees me score, that 3-pointer or something like that. Like we're always trying to be put in this gaze of the other, but that's not a problem for Schraber, because it's never a problem of identity. But in this anticipation, this imaginary anticipation, there is in this narcissism, because he's fully invested in this imaginary, a sense of frustration and erotomania, that if God is too close, it becomes frustrating. But if God is too far, it is also a bit frustrating, because a part of the imaginary is that it's never, its temporality is a gap. That's why the importance of the signifier is that it allows its absence to be sustained, even if it's not there. Let's go back to the famous example of the elephant, right? He says you don't have to have an elephant in the room to talk about it or sustain a discourse. The signifier alone allows absence, to happen, and yet discourse remain. This imaginary phenomenological feeling of lack, though it does have a symbolic structure in it, still can sustain one's desire to strive for the thing in the ego ideal, which for Schraber, it's not that. It's this sort of imaginary anticipation of God coming to God. And yet when he gets close, it's like the part that still confuses me about, like, what does Luder have to mean for him? And why does it kind of send him back in this motion that is comparable to Lacan's analogy of the stickleback in this imaginary lure, which is predicated for him off of frustration and eros, or aggressivity and eros. I should correct myself. Yeah. Not just frustration is constitutive of the imaginary.
Why was it again that he's so egocentric? What was the explanation? What was the explanation again? Why psychotics are so what's the word? Centered on themselves, or the world for them is only about them?
Well, I think it goes back to Freud's essay on the loss of reality, in which we both, the neurotic and psychotic, in a sense, reality in the sort of objective sense is lost, but what is substituted for, at least if we're Lacanian about it, this substitute for the neurotic is that sort of metaphor and metonymy, which desire is exemplary of the objet, which I always kind of anticipated as being. But for the psychotic, it is their delusion, and he even talks about it in Narcissism, about like what is, if I'm not mistaken, Nick, what does he talk about, like a certain wound, how like when someone has a wound, like all of reality externally and their emphasis on that reality gets lost because they're so like physically focused and putting their attention on a wound. So it's like if there is like this investment of a psychical wound, that replaces reality. And so narcissism should be seen as a wound, a constitutive wound. And so in there, secondary narcissism becomes that wound of like creating a world in which like he's forsaken, or whatever the German term is. And so, like he's in a world where all he knows is that he's trying to be for God. And yet there's always this wound of aggressivity, erotomania. And it's specifically erotomania for him because God wants him and only him.
But isn't it interesting that he doesn't, as far as I know, ever achieve his goal?
No.
Right? Of being impregnated by God. He can't.
No. That's the thing. He mentions something like Lacan says about this is his Aufhebung, about like the canceling out of like this nonsense. It's like the obstacle is also the motor force of his delusion. It's like he can't get near God, but yet that striving, that obstacle makes him strive to one day.
And it kind of mirrors the structure of neurotic desire in that sense.
Right.
Totally. And I think, I mean, he is not from the beginning completely sure why he is affected by this delusion. The only thing that is like consistent through the whole thing is this feminization. So it begins with what would it be like to experience sexuality as a woman, like this thought. And this, like, as Lacan says, like through his whole delusion, it always goes through this feminization. But he isn't that sure about why he has these delusions from the beginning. But his finals, he is just sure that they are happening, right? And that they are real. That's what he's sure of. But only in the end, when he heals himself, he is sure that he is the wife of God. Because in the beginning, he thinks like something's going on with Flexig and they are wanting to rape him or something like that. But he's not sure from the beginning, only in the end. And I think Freud is so good on this, or pretty much correct, that he's struggling with castration. He's struggling with castration. And he doesn't know how to integrate castration. He cannot, right? He cannot, because it never happened, this integration. So he needs to find some other way around it. And he can only do that through his delusion, through his egomaniac fantasy. And he integrates it by being like, yeah, someday I will be a woman and I will have sex with God. Not now, but someday. And then he's sure that something will happen.
He's like, it's almost like saying, well, I don't need the phallus in the first place because I'm a woman.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he's not happy about it, right? He's not happy about it in the beginning. He can only become happy when it's like this giant fantasy of, oh my God, I'm the wife of God. Like, you cannot go higher than that. Like,
right. And I find it,
castration.
No, right. Isn't that funny though? In the way that you broke down how God appears like from beginning to middle into like sort of the later Schreber, it's like we have Flessig and who tries to rape him and feminize him.
Yeah.
And yet then you have like God who has him there to lie. It's like lie as what? Like lie down as a woman. And then there's like the one hope of one day being able to be the woman for God and repopulate the entire.
Yeah. I mean, liegen lassen is also from the beginning there.
Yeah.
Right? Just
right.
The middle, ignore the middle part. It's just from being raped to becoming wife of God.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some intermediate steps. But through the entirety, liegen lassen is there the whole time. It's just the whole process is whatever, without my ego being hurt. Right? That's kind of the story, I think.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we could do something, it's a little outlandish, but sort of read Schreber's predicament in the light of the father of the primal horde, you know, and this idea, it's like, what is castration for the neurotic within that myth? We have the father of the primal horde who has a right to all the women, who all the women are his in this harem, and it frustrates the brotherhood to such a degree that they slay the father, but then inherit this guilt. And none of them are able to fully enjoy in the way that the father of the primal horde was now, because it's like they need to reverse that law, but also in some sense atone for it. Right. Now, the father of the primal horde, as the, let's say, the name of the father is more powerful dead than he was alive, in a sense, he becomes the constitutive exception. Yeah. Which basically creates a parity between all the individual members of this brotherhood. Like, that's castration right there. Yeah. And you see it in, you know, fraternities, in the way men, heterosexual, cisgender type men, like, happen to be, is like they're always kind of keeping in check each other's enjoyment, right? There's this whole idea of like the Andrew Tate type alpha male who's out there, but they're few and far between anyone who's like living up to that parity. Right. In reality, it's kind of like everyone keeping each other's enjoyment in check, and that's managing castration. Right. But what about Schreber is he's kind of like, he's saying like, it's almost like he's assuming the identity of the harem of women.
Yeah. Oh my God, totally. Right. Oh my God, that's like, genius. That's genius, man. Yeah.
Fine. Okay, I'm not the father of the primal horde. If I'm less than a man, I am the wife of God. I
Yeah.
am all the women that the father of the
Dude, you're a
primal horde.
genius. You
Yeah, no,
are
that
absolutely
sounds
genius.
about right. I also always this made me think of like the way in which like castration has to be kept in check with like Zizek's example in Plague of Fantasies, where he talks about like during the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, people in the Yugoslavian army would do very homosexual gestures at one, but at the same time, sort of make a parody of it. And so like an example of like they would greet somebody who like was in for a long time and had rank. It's like the way they greet them was like the pull hardly goes unsmoked or some stuff, some shit like that, or like he's one cunt that isn't used well enough or something like that that's been used well enough. And then the fact that they would be like in line sneaking up on each other and they would like poke them in the butt and they'd be like, it wasn't me, it wasn't me. So like the way, and there's like in a sense like not a perverted disavow, but like in the way that the prohibition of the father and castration come up in a parody.
Yeah, it's like no homo is
Yeah, right.
keeping
Well, yeah,
castration.
that's for Nine right there. No homo or like, no.
No, but
Totally, yeah.
Nick, you are genius. You are genius. Like this is completely like you. This is amazing. Like this is really psychosis. It's like, okay, I don't want to be castrated. I cannot be the boss of the horde. Okay, I'm gonna be the wife of the boss.
Yeah.
That's absolutely it, man.
Yeah.
Wow, it's so good.
You got it. That's Schraber. You gotta respect Schraber, and you can tell that like Lacan does, because like the more you delve into it, you're like, you know what? Maybe psychosis is the way to go, and that's one of the things he says is that like maybe the psychiatrist is afraid of the seductions of psychosis. One reason that they try to get the patient to proceed in an order.
But that just shows
There's
that he's preceding D and G already. Like he already said what D and G tries to do, you know.
Yeah.
But it's different, you know, because I
different.
feel like D&G, they're just like, we want to be free.
You're right, right.
There's
They
something really political.
romanticize. They're romanticizing it.
Totally, because it is not free. Like his experience, zero freedom.
Yeah,
It's
there's
super overdeterminant.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it sucks. They must have read up till this chapter, but not the next one,
Yeah.
D&G, because it's like the next one is all about the limitations of.
Yeah.
I mean, they must have misread the whole of Schreber's book also.
Yeah. I don't think
Because
that
it doesn't sound fun or free.
I don't think there were in any of the seminars, because the seminars didn't really get published until after Lacan's death. I think they read some of the Acree. I don't know what seminar Guattari started coming into, but I think like they try to make up for it by like combining Schreber with Artaud, because it's Artaud that's the one that came up with bodies without organs.
But how do you do schizoanalysis? Like if you had Schreber as a patient, would you be like, oh yeah, no, I hear those voices too. You're right. I can also hear him. Like, what do you like reinforce? You want to make everyone psychotic?
Transversality over transference, apparently. I don't know what that means, but
no, but
you are the wife of God.
Yeah.
one more thing about what you said, Nick, because we mentioned that before, that like the psychotic is super sure about what he's supposed to do, but this example that you gave, it's like through that he kind of makes the big other exist, you know, it exists for him in its entirety. It's like for the neurotic, it doesn't exist. Like the boss of the horde, like the primal father, doesn't exist anymore, only in a negated form, but for him it exists. And I don't know, I know so little about perversion. I know nothing about it, but
well, the problem with perversion is that castration happens, but in a sense, there's a trauma in which like there's an identification with the imaginary, that they inflict castration on others to reenact the thing. So like they don't have a fantasy, it's that the fantasy is kind of produced within the act itself through a sadism or masochism.
And can we figure out how to put that into the primal horde example?
Well,
so psychotic is the wife.
If anything, that perversion would be the law itself, like a sort of law that is just like impossible.
Well, what did you say once, Andrew, that really, you said something that stuck with me about like being both the invoker of the name of the Father and the instrumental law
Yes.
simultaneously,
Yeah, they're in
which
this
is
weird.
dude.
Right. And so they're in this weird sort of contradiction in which the pervert reenacts this moment of castration in which they are the castrating agent and they're also trying to bring the enjoyment to the other, in which the other, not only are they castrated, but they also accept the law as the law. So like they reenact this imaginary image that they have of when they were a kid and they were like susceptible to this trauma onto the other person, onto this other, and they are the sort of arbiter of the law. And it's like, let me feel your enjoyment, let me be your other for the other. And so they're in this double bind of like being the castrating agent and also the super ego instrumentalizing force of it.
Yeah.
Enjoy, and then also trying to posit this childlike self that never was onto an other so that they could reenact it, because they need that law. They're the ones that are duped to believe that there is an other, that there is a law. It's just like the world is broken, or like they come up with some like weird scenario. It's just like people these days don't enjoy enough. It's like in your stereotypical like sadist, masochist, serial killer type thing. I seek divine retribution. Like the vigilante type is definitely the pervert taking
It's
the law on your own
make the
hands.
big other exist by being its enforcer or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
What, Andrew, can you explain like the connection between the name of the Father and the big other? Because if the name of the Father is foreclosed for the psychotic, and he doesn't have a big other for the neurotic, how does the big other come about via the name of the Father?
Right. So like with the name of the Father, you have that which is the signifier, which is the paternal metaphor, the name of the Father, which is also the know of the Father, which is prohibitory. It's a prohibitive function, but then also allows for what's enjoyable. The big other then is, for Lacan, his slight definition is the network of language creates a circuit in which the big other is that sort of virtual byproduct, a gaze that looks at you performing this law or performing your duty. In your ego ideal, there is always this big other that is there. And I would say it's like when you look at politics, like the sort of like mouthwash bro would be like, oh yeah, Biden's the big other, like of America, but like no, he's a little other. The big other would be like freedom or America. And then with the name of the Father, you have the phallus. And so like for the Pope, it would be like the scepter, the cross. For king, it's the crown, a flag for a nation. And so like the big other sees is the virtual gaze that is no one, just like the subject is no one. And yet it can only operate through the performance and the discourse of language. I don't know if that kind of simplifies it in a not so jargony way. But what helps me is always to think that the name of the Father and the phallus are consubstantial, which I like how Lacan says that, because that's a theological term. It's consubstantial, not created but begotten. That's like used when you say that the Son of God, Christ, is begotten by God the Father, not created. And so it's like the name of the phallus exists contingent to the name of the Father, insofar as the name of the Father is a function. So through the functionality, the phallus is there to provide that which is enjoyable, because the name of the Father can't be prohibited on its own. There's also something that is enjoyable.
Can I add something to that? Or do you want to say something?
No, yeah, that was it.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, for the name of the Father, I read this paper by Miller, which was super interesting. I think it's like one of the most famous secondary sources or earliest secondary sources on Lacan, which was called Suture, Elements on the Logic of the Signifier. And great, didn't understand a lot, but one thing I found interesting was that like this first metaphor, which starts this metonymic chain, is counting 0 as 1. This idea that it's like this first thing where you have one signifier which signifies lack, right? Lack of the following signifier. And that's like the name of the father is the signifier put on this void that is the jouissance of the mother. But I could be wrong on that. This is how I kind of explain it to myself. And then this is where it's like, well, you cannot have your mother, but you can have all these other women. So it's like the next metonymic signifier would be like the substitution for this lack that is the jouissance of the mother. So like the other woman, you substitute your mother with in this mythological language of Freud.
No. Yeah, I mean, I've read a bit of that essay, but that seems to be right. And I always make. I mean, you brought up like the whole primal horde and like the tape bro. Isn't it funny how like these alpha bros too like are like, man, you won't catch me with other women, and then like they'll post about like how much they love their mother so much, and they're like shout out to the woman who created me, and it's just like this sort of like
Yeah.
weird,
No one
like,
can replace her. The only woman I care about.
yeah.
It's so cringe. Oh my God.
But it's a strange like, oh, I need to completely segregate my sexual libidinal desires from what is this like pure connection that I have with my mother, who's the only woman in my life. Obviously, no suggestion whatsoever that you would want to have sex with your mother in there. Complete, like, it's not there. Don't look for any subtext. It's like,
it's
you know,
it's so interesting that it's
more
explicitly related to other women, which are then implied to be sexual partners, right?
Right. Yeah. Like why contrast her from other women?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
it's funny. It's like it's trying to, in some sense, like manifest the woman, right, as a counterpart to the man, but the woman doesn't exist.
Right. It's like the woman who could like be your mother, but at the same time maybe be your lover, but not be your lover because it's like something that transcends sexuality itself.
Is that then perversity to try to be the primal father?
Well, yeah, if you're like this, like maybe it would be like for an other who lacks, like the other for another. It's like, but then it would come into confusion because like I don't think that they're trying to be the law; they're trying to be instruments of a law.
Yeah, true.
But there is that other play on non du père version.
Yeah,
father version of the father.
Right.
Like it's yeah.
Right, that's where I heard like who talked about was that Miller that mentioned that play? I think it was Miller in an essay.
What play?
Paraversion.
Is it a play?
I think so, or something. It's like I know like he mentions that paraversion and
I thought it was just
words or a theater play.
I thought it was just one of Lacan's puns there, paraversion.
I mean, it probably is, but I remember hearing that from Miller I think it's one of the essays on perversion in the reading seminars 1 and 2. That could be wrong.
So it's like the disavowal. Wait, what's perversion? So psychotic is foreclosure. Perversion is disavowal, no?
Disavowal.
Yeah. What are they disavowing?
They're disavowing pretty much the law that allows them to function. Like they realize that they lack too, but the knowledge of them having it, like they have a weird relationship not only to the unconscious but to repression itself. Like they could acknowledge something in them, and yet at the same time that justifies them to be able to act in a sort of way of like they may not enjoy in an everyday sense. They're like miserable, but in a sort of sexual dynamic, like they enjoy, in which like they try to promote the law of castration onto another being. And it's like they don't want like the sort of like enjoyment of like sexuality and in intercourse, like it's in a more like torturous, sadistic, masochistic way, cruel and humiliating, or being humiliated. Like that's in a way that they kind of operate. I mean, like I always go through like reading like or not reading, but Solo, like that's a perfect example of seeing like how disavowal operates, or just perversion in the law, or any of Sod's works. I mean, it's like no wonder why Lacan like sees Sod like as like the completion of Kant, like the truth of Kant.
Yeah, like I think too often, like I fall into the habit of thinking of disavowal as like a kind of denial, but think about the way disavowals work, just what it means in everyday sense. It's just like, oh, I didn't say that, I didn't do that, that's not me, you know, and that's like what the pervert does, right? But I am but the instrument of
Right.
the law, which though is a self-resourced, self-originating law.
Yeah.
But they don't
I mean,
wouldn't
just
say
ask
that, right? Like
to get
the
the full
state
set, you know.
what?
I just wanted to ask that to get the full set of the story of the primal father, because we have such a beautiful story now about the psychotic origin as being another concubine.
Right.
The concubine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of it, right? There's no others. It's just me.
Because it makes sense because it's like the father of the primal horde basically is populating the world.
Yes. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Absolutely. It fits perfectly. Yes. That's genius.
Right.
No, I never read that anywhere. Nick, you need to write a paper.
Yeah. We should definitely do a. We should
Before that
definitely
episode comes out.
We should definitely like do a side
All
project
right. Yeah.
on the stuff.
You need to
That,
claim that idea.
let's yeah, I need to claim that now.
Yeah.
Although maybe it has been. I'll ask Mikey, he would know. He's familiar with the literature, but yeah. Because the feminization of Schreber is like under discussed too. It's like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so we've got 3 different essays on the docket right now. We should probably end the episode here, but
Yeah, I don't really
while
know
I'm
how
being
to build
praised,
that,
you
right?
know, that's how I like to end the episode. Praise being heaped onto me
Yeah.
as the wife of God.
Yeah. The miracles.
We should end it with an open-ended sentence like episodes ago.
Yeah.
Right. What did we learn like a new one? What was the
Isn't it true that